The doctor, when he arrived some 20 minutes later, confirmed what everyone in the drawing room had already begun to suspect. Margaret Ashworth had been poisoned. The empty teacup, the faint almond scent that lingered near her lips despite the sharp medicinal smell of the brandy someone had foolishly attempted to pour down her throat, the small flecks of foam at the corners of her mouth. These details painted a picture that required no medical degree to interpret. Dr. Pemberton, who had served St. Mary Mead for 30 years and possessed the kind of competence born from long practice rather than particular brilliance, examined the body with professional efficiency before stepping back and saying the words that transformed a garden party into a crime scene. The police arrived within the hour, summoned by the vicar, who had demonstrated admirable presence of mind despite his general nervousness. Inspector Craddock, who had made the 30-mile journey from the county town, was a man of perhaps 50 with the kind of methodical manner that suggested he had solved enough murders to understand that panic rarely aided investigation. He was accompanied by a younger sergeant whose name nobody quite caught, preoccupied as everyone was with the gravity of the situation. The guests had been moved to the morning room, a cheerful space that now seemed obscenely inappropriate for the mood that had settled over them like fog. Miss Marple found herself seated near the window, ostensibly overlooked by the authorities, which was precisely where she preferred to be. From this vantage point, she could observe not only the assembled guests, but also their reactions to one another. These reactions, she had learned over many years of village life, often revealed more than any confession could. The initial shock had begun to wear off, replaced by something more complicated. Mrs. Patricia Harding sat rigidly on the sofa, her handbag clutched in her lap as though it might fly away. The vicar's wife kept opening her mouth as if to speak, then closing it again, producing a peculiar, repetitive motion that suggested profound internal conflict. Colonel Hastings had assumed the slightly glazed expression of someone who had witnessed something that did not quite fit into his understanding of how the world operated. Gerald Thornton, the bank manager, had positioned himself near the door as though ready to leave at the first opportunity. What interested Miss Marple most, however, was the behavior of the three people who had formed that particular triangle of tension before the murder. Martin Ashworth stood with his back to the room, looking out at the garden where, moments before, his mother had been distributing refreshments with her characteristic careful grace. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw clenched. Whether this was grief or something else entirely was difficult to say. Claire Bellingham sat in a wing-back chair, her hands folded in her lap with almost painful precision, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall that contained no particular feature of interest. And Helena Wickham, the headmistress, had positioned herself as far from both of them as possible, her expression one of carefully maintained composure that only barely concealed something that might have been fear. But it was Constance Drake who most arrested Miss Marple's attention. The London visitor had taken a seat slightly apart from the others, and while everyone else in the room was engaged in the nervous fidgeting or studied composure that characterized their particular responses to crisis, Constance was doing something rather different. She was watching. Her eyes moved from face to face with the intensity of someone taking inventory, cataloging reactions, measuring responses. When she thought no one was observing her, and Miss Marple was quite adept at observing people who believed themselves unobserved, a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. It was not the smile of someone grieving the death of a sister, or even of someone shocked by an unexpected tragedy. It was the smile of someone who had known something was going to happen, though perhaps not exactly what form it would take. Inspector Craddock entered the morning room and began his preliminary questions. When had anyone last seen Margaret Ashworth alive? Who had served her tea? Had anyone noticed anything unusual about her behavior? The questions were competent and thorough, if somewhat lacking in insight. The answers came back uniformly. She had seemed well. She had poured her own tea from the service in the drawing-room. Nothing unusual had been observed. It was not until the inspector asked about the previous week, whether anyone knew if Margaret Ashworth had received any unusual visitors, any correspondence, any indication that she was troubled about something, that Miss Marple noticed Constance Drake's fingers tighten ever so slightly on the armrest of her chair. This small gesture lasted perhaps half a second. It was accompanied by a tightening at the corners of her eyes, a brief cessation of that cataloguing attention she had been directing toward the other guests. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed. Constance relaxed. Her expression resumed its appearance of composed detachment, and she volunteered, in a voice that conveyed the right degree of uncertainty, that she had only arrived that previous week and could therefore offer no observations about her sister's state of mind in the days preceding. Inspector Craddock, satisfied with this response, moved on to other questions, but Miss Marple remained interested in Constance Drake. Because in that single instant of loss of composure, something had been revealed. Not guilt, precisely, but knowledge. Constance Drake knew something about Margaret Ashworth's death. She might not have administered the poison, though the possibility could not be entirely dismissed, but she possessed information that she was choosing, with some difficulty, to conceal. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the morning room where 8 suspects and 1 puzzled detective began the elaborate dance of investigation that would occupy them all for days to come. By evening, the preliminary interviews had concluded, and Inspector Craddock had arranged for the body to be removed by the county coroner's office. The guests had been dismissed with instructions to remain available for further questioning, a directive that produced a collective sense of unease that would linger in St. Mary Mead like smoke from a poorly drawing chimney. The village, Miss Marple reflected as she walked home through the gathering dusk, had the peculiar quality of small communities that had experienced disruption, a sense that normalcy had been suspended indefinitely, and no one was quite certain when or if it would be restored. Her cottage, Daisy Cottage, sat at the end of a winding lane lined with hawthorn hedges. It was exactly the sort of residence one might expect for a spinster of modest means and considerable years. Tidy, well-maintained, with a garden that received more attention than the house itself. Miss Marple's maid, Lucy, had left a tray in the sitting-room, cold chicken, bread, and a pot of tea that had gone lukewarm during the hours of the afternoon's disturbance. She ate mechanically, her mind engaged with the afternoon's events in the methodical way that others might work through a puzzle. What interested her most was not the murder itself. Poisoning was a relatively straightforward affair, usually indicating premeditation and a specific relationship between killer and victim, but rather the peculiar configuration of secrets that had manifested itself during the garden party. Poisoning, she had learned, was almost never simply about the death of one person. It was about relationships, about money, about the accumulated grievances that people nursed in the quiet corners of their hearts, waiting for the right moment to manifest. The telephone rang at 9:30, startling her from her reflections. It was the vicar's wife, breathless with the kind of urgent gossip that only comes from information one believes oneself duty-bound to share. She had heard from the vicar, who had heard from Inspector Craddock before the police departed, that the poison had been cyanide, quick-acting, efficient, and the sort of substance that was occasionally present in gardens. It was used as a pesticide by the more modern-minded gardeners. This detail, Mrs. Vicar assured Miss Marple with some excitement, opened the field of suspects considerably. Almost anyone with a knowledge of gardening might have access to such a substance. But Miss Marple's response was not about the poison itself. Instead, she asked a question that caused a momentary pause on the other end of the line. Had Mrs. Vicar noticed anything unusual about Constance Drake's demeanor during the interviews? There was a lengthy silence before Mrs. Vicar admitted that no. She could not say that she had particularly noticed Constance Drake at all during the interviews, having been too preoccupied with her own nervousness about potentially being questioned regarding her presence at the party. After the call ended, Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting. The small blue cardigan she had been working on, a commission from the vicar's wife for the expected arrival of a grandchild, required several more hours of work before it would be complete. She knitted slowly and methodically, the repetitive motion allowing her mind to work at the problem before her. The next morning brought news that had travelled through the village with the speed of water finding its level. Margaret Ashworth's will had been read by her solicitor, a matter of simple procedure, but one that had produced significant results. The bulk of her considerable estate, which included not only Thornfield Manor but also a number of investment properties that generated reliable income, had been left to her sister, Constance Drake. Martin Ashworth, her only child, had been left the house in which he currently resided, a modest property worth perhaps a quarter of the value of the main estate, and a sum of money that, while respectable, represented only a fraction of the total inheritance. This revelation transformed the landscape of possible motives considerably. Miss Marple found herself, as she attended to her morning correspondence, thinking about inheritance and family relationships and the peculiar ways that money could shift the allegiances and resentments that bound people together. Martin Ashworth, it seemed, had been provided for adequately but not generously, the sort of arrangement that could breed resentment in a person disposed toward resentment, but which might equally indicate a mother's deliberate intention to encourage independence. But it was the fact that Constance Drake had inherited almost everything that suggested itself most forcefully to Miss Marple's considerations. The London visitor, the woman with the sharp features and the analytical gaze, had suddenly acquired considerable wealth and property. She had also, it seemed, known in advance that this inheritance was coming. The brief moment of composure lost during the inspector's questions suggested as much. She had not murdered her sister in a sudden fit of passion or desperation. The murder had been anticipated, prepared for, and executed with a cold precision that suggested planning. Yet as Miss Marple considered this line of reasoning, a small voice of doubt presented itself. Constance Drake was many things: calculating, observant, presumably clever enough to have engineered or at least anticipated a murder. But was she truly the sort of person to murder her own sister? And if she had, why had she looked so profoundly interested in observing the other suspects, as though cataloguing their reactions to something she had not herself orchestrated? By afternoon, Miss Marple had determined that she needed to visit Thornfield Manor, ostensibly to pay her respects to the family, but actually to observe more carefully the dynamics that governed the Ashworth household. It was a plan that would require some delicacy to execute, but delicacy was precisely what Miss Marple possessed in abundance. The visit to Thornfield Manor was arranged with the sort of careful considerateness that characterized Miss Marple's approach to social navigation. She sent a note, handwritten as was proper, to Constance Drake expressing her condolences and offering to provide assistance with the arrangements that necessarily followed a death in the family. The response came back within the hour, conveyed by a boy from the village, inviting Miss Marple to tea at 3 o'clock. It was, she reflected, precisely the sort of response one would expect from a woman of breeding, even if that woman had recently acquired her improved circumstances through her sister's murder. The afternoon was warm, with that particular quality of English summer heat that seemed to press down upon the landscape rather than energize it. Miss Marple dressed in her customary grey, adding only a brooch of modest silver that had belonged to her mother, and walked to Thornfield Manor at a pace that suggested neither hurry nor particular reluctance. The house, viewed in daylight and without the distraction of a garden party, revealed itself as a structure of genuine architectural interest. Victorian in its bones, but with recent renovations that suggested Margaret Ashworth had possessed both money and taste. It was Martin Ashworth who answered the door, his expression a mixture of surprise and something that might have been wariness. He ushered Miss Marple into the hall with the courtesy that breeding demands, though she noticed that his movements were somewhat stiff, as though his body was operating under conscious control rather than natural ease. Constance Drake emerged from the morning room as though she had been waiting for the sound of the doorbell. She was dressed in a black dress of excellent cut, not the heavy mourning attire of an earlier generation, but something more contemporary that suggested grief managed through the application of style. Her manner was impeccable, warm without being effusive, sad without being theatrical. "Miss Marple," she said, extending her hand. "How thoughtful of you to come. I confess the last 48 hours have been rather overwhelming." The afternoon tea was served in the drawing room, the very space where Margaret Ashworth had been discovered dead. This placement seemed deliberate to Miss Marple, a kind of assertion that the room had not been fundamentally changed by what had occurred within it. Yet she noticed that Martin Ashworth avoided sitting in the chair where his mother had died, choosing instead a position near the window that allowed him to look out at the garden. The conversation began with the expected pleasantries, observations about the weather, comments on the beauty of the roses, murmurs of sympathy regarding the shock of sudden death. But as Constance poured tea and offered small cakes that no one seemed inclined to eat, Miss Marple gradually steered the discussion toward more personal territory. "I understand," she said carefully, "that you have only recently come to St. Mary Mead. From London, I believe." Constance nodded, her expression reflecting an appropriate degree of sadness. "I arrived last week specifically to spend time with Margaret. We had not seen each other in rather longer than ideal, and I thought it would be pleasant to have a few weeks together. Instead—" She allowed the sentence to trail away, letting the unspoken completion hang in the air. "Margaret did not mention that you were coming?" Miss Marple asked, her tone suggesting simple curiosity rather than interrogation. There was a pause. It was brief, barely noticeable to someone not paying close attention, but Miss Marple was always paying close attention. "No," Constance said finally. "I thought I would surprise her. I'd written to say I was coming, but I made rather a point of the surprise element. I wanted to see how she would receive an unexpected visit." "How very like you, Constance," Martin said from his position by the window, his voice carrying an edge that made Miss Marple's ears sharpen with interest. "Always concerned with observing how people react rather than simply being present." Constance set down her teacup with precise care. "That is hardly a fair characterization, Martin. I've always taken an interest in people, yes. That does not make me a cold observer of life. I simply have a tendency toward analytical interest." "Is that what you call it?" Martin turned from the window, and Miss Marple saw in his face something she had not clearly observed before, a profound resentment that went deeper than simple grief. "Mother called it manipulation. She said you had always been the sort of person who moved others about like chess pieces on a board, and that the game interested you far more than the outcomes." This revelation hung in the air between them, charged with the kind of familiarity that only comes from years of accumulated conflict. Constance's composure, which had been maintained with remarkable steadiness, flickered for just an instant. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more controlled. "Your mother and I had our differences, certainly. Siblings often do, but I did not kill her, Martin, if that is what you are suggesting." "I am suggesting nothing," Martin replied, turning back to the garden. "I am merely observing that you have inherited almost everything, that you arrived unexpectedly, and that you seem remarkably composed for a woman grieving the sudden loss of her sister." Miss Marple, recognizing the moment for what it was, a fracture in the careful facade that both Ashworths had been maintaining, set down her own cup and made a small sound of gentle reproval. "How distressing this must be for you both," she said, addressing herself to the room in general. "The loss of someone so central to one's life, combined with the necessity of understanding how and why that loss occurred. It creates a kind of turmoil that manifests differently in different people." She turned to Constance with an expression of maternal sympathy. "Tell me, Miss Drake, in your years away from St. Mary Mead, did you maintain close contact with your sister, Or had the distance between you grown into something rather more substantial than mere geography? Constance's response came slowly, as though she were considering how much truth the question warranted. The distance grew, she admitted finally. After I left St. Mary Mead, which was rather precipitously, I confess, Margaret and I corresponded, but the letters became increasingly formal. We saw each other perhaps twice in the last 15 years. The last time was 3 years ago, at a funeral in London. We had lunch afterward, and it was cordial but distant. The sort of interaction that suggests people share a history, but no longer share a present. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as though this explanation confirmed something she had already suspected. "And yet you came back," she observed gently. "You came back quite suddenly, and you surprised your sister with your arrival. That suggests something had changed, some reason to bridge that distance, or perhaps some anticipation that the distance might be about to change in some other way." Martin made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "Go on, Miss Marple. Ask her about the letter." Constance's head turned sharply toward her nephew. "Martin, I do not think—" "There was a letter," Martin continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for the opportunity to speak an uncomfortable truth. "Mother received it about 2 weeks before the garden party. I saw it on her desk. It was from you, Constance, and after she read it, she was different, distracted. She made an appointment with Solicitor Thornton, old Gerald Thornton's father, who still handles some of her affairs, and she was rather secretive about the purpose of the appointment. I asked her what was wrong, and she said nothing was wrong, but something was different. The temperature in the drawing room seemed to have dropped perceptibly. Miss Marple watched Constance with a kind of attention that suggested she was no longer making polite conversation, but rather conducting an investigation of her own. "What did the letter say?" she asked quietly. Constance stood abruptly and walked to the window, positioning herself next to, but not quite touching Martin. When she spoke, her voice had taken on a different quality, less carefully controlled, more genuinely troubled. "The letter said that I needed to come home, that there was something Margaret needed to discuss with me in person, something that could not be adequately conveyed through correspondence. It said that our estrangement had gone on long enough, and that certain matters from our past needed to be addressed before it was too late." "Did she indicate what those matters were?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Constance said. "That was the frustrating part. The letter was deliberately vague, which was typical of Margaret. She always did have a tendency toward dramatic effect. I assumed it was about our mother's estate. There were complications with the distribution when Mother died, some ambiguities about certain properties and investments. I thought perhaps Margaret had finally decided to settle those matters properly." Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints required consideration before movement. She walked slowly around the drawing room, her eyes taking in details, the arrangement of furniture, the placement of objects on the mantelpiece, the particular quality of light that filtered through the windows. She paused before the blue armchair where Margaret Ashworth had died, and she looked at it with the intensity of someone reading a particularly important passage in a book. "The poison was administered in the tea," she said, speaking more to herself than to the others in the room. "The cup is broken, but the residue suggests that Margaret drank the entire cup quite quickly, as though she was thirsty or perhaps distracted. The almond scent would not have been immediately noticeable if mixed with a particularly flavorful tea. Margaret preferred Earl Grey, I understand. The bergamot would mask the cyanide quite effectively. Inspector Craddock has already established all of this," Martin said, his tone suggesting irritation at Miss Marple's pedestrian observations. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But what Inspector Craddock has not established, I think, is precisely when the poison was administered. Was it before the garden party began, during the party, or was it perhaps something that Margaret consumed before the guests arrived?" She turned to face Constance directly. "You arrived the previous week. You had the run of the house. You would have known where Margaret kept her tea things, would have understood her habits. It would have been remarkably simple to prepare a specific cup of tea with cyanide, to place it somewhere that Margaret would eventually consume it. The timing would be uncertain, yes, but poisons work relatively quickly, and there is no particular advantage to knowing the exact moment of death if one is sufficiently careful about establishing an alibi. Constance's face had gone very pale. "I did no such thing," she said, but her voice lacked the force of genuine outrage. It carried instead the quality of a denial made because denial was required, not because it carried conviction. "I am not suggesting that you did," Miss Marple said, and her voice was remarkably gentle. "But I am suggesting that someone very much wants us to believe that you did. Or perhaps more accurately, that someone wants us to believe that you might have done. Which raises a rather interesting question. Who in this house, or in this village, would benefit most from your being suspected of murder?" The drawing room fell silent, the weight of the question settling over it like fog rolling in from the marshes. It was Martin who broke the silence, though not with words. Instead, he made a movement toward the door, a subtle shift in posture that suggested an intention to leave the room. Miss Marple, with the uncanny timing of someone who had spent 70 years reading human behavior, spoke with a clarity that halted his progress. "You received considerably less from your mother's will than one might have expected," she observed, her tone remaining conversational despite the accusatory nature of the statement. "A house worth perhaps a quarter of the total estate and a modest sum of money. For a man approaching 40, with no apparent employment or prospects, that represents a disappointment rather than a provision." "My financial circumstances are hardly your concern," Martin replied, but he did not attempt to leave again. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but they are relevant to understanding the structure of motives that surrounds your mother's death. Inspector Craddock, I suspect, has already begun to understand that the will provides a clear indication of motive. For your Aunt Constance, certainly, but also, in a curious way, for you. Because if your aunt were convicted of murdering your mother, the inheritance would presumably revert to you or be tied up in legal proceedings for years. Either way, you would benefit from her being removed from the position of inheritor." Constance turned sharply toward her nephew, her eyes widening with a comprehension that suggested she had not previously considered this possibility. "Martin, surely you are not suggesting—" "I am not suggesting anything," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I'm simply observing that the situation contains a certain elegant complexity. 3 people with connections to your mother, 3 people present or recently arrived, 3 potential motives that appear at first glance to indicate guilt." She returned to her chair and settled herself with the deliberate care of age, folding her hands in her lap. "Let us consider what we know with certainty. Margaret Ashworth received a letter from her estranged sister requesting that she come home to discuss old matters. She made an appointment with her solicitor, suggesting that she intended to make changes to her will. She was poisoned with cyanide administered through her tea during what was meant to be a pleasant afternoon garden party. And immediately after her death, we discovered that the will had already been changed, leaving almost everything to Constance Drake. The will was already changed before she died. Martin's voice carried a note of genuine surprise. "According to the solicitor's records," Miss Marple confirmed. "Yes. The changes were made approximately 1 week before the garden party. Margaret visited Solicitor Thornton's office on the Tuesday morning, instructed him to revise her will, and signed the new document that same day. He has confirmed this with Inspector Craddock." The implications of this timing seemed to settle over the room like a particularly heavy fog. If Margaret had already changed her will, if she had already decided to leave the majority of her estate to Constance, then Constance's motive for murder became considerably less obvious. A woman who knows she's about to inherit a substantial estate has little reason to accelerate that inheritance through criminal means. "Why would Mother change her will?" Martin asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice now, layered beneath the resentment. She had never indicated any intention to alter the arrangements she had made. "Because," Miss Marple said softly. She had discovered something that made her reconsider what she believed about her estranged sister and what she believed about her own son. She allowed this statement to hang in the air for a moment before continuing. The letter from Constance was not, I suspect, primarily about old family grievances. It was about something more immediate, more urgent. And when Margaret summoned her sister home, when she met with her solicitor, when she changed her will, she was taking action based on information that had recently come to her attention. Miss Marple rose again and walked to a small table where a vase of roses stood in water. She examined the flowers with apparent absorption, though her attention was primarily directed toward the conversation occurring behind her. "There is a young woman who teaches at the village school," she continued conversationally. "Miss Helena Wickham. She was at the garden party, and she was observed in close conversation with you, Mr. Ashworth, on more than one occasion. They are quite recent acquaintances, I believe, within the last month or so." Martin did not respond, but his silence was itself informative. "Miss Wickham is intelligent, attractive, and of appropriate social standing for your circumstances," Miss Marple observed, turning back to face him. "She would represent, for a man in your position, a connection to stability and respectability. One might almost say she represented hope for a future that seemed previously rather constrained." "I fail to see how my personal attachments concern you," Martin said coldly. "They do not concern me personally," Miss Marple agreed. "But they would concern your mother if she had discovered something troubling about Miss Wickham's background or character. Or perhaps, more accurately, if she had discovered that Miss Wickham's interest in you was not what it appeared to be." Constance made a small sound, something between a gasp and a laugh. "You are suggesting that the girl, Helena Wickham, was somehow involved in Mother's death?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the threads of this particular mystery are considerably more tangled than they initially appeared, and that the person who benefits most from suspicion falling upon you, Miss Drake, may not be your nephew, but rather someone whose connection to this household is far more recent and considerably more calculated." The remainder of Miss Marple's visit was marked by a tension that neither civility nor good breeding could entirely conceal. She left Thornfield Manor at 4:30, declining the offer of additional tea with a gracious smile, and made her way back through the village with the unhurried pace of someone who had arrived at a significant realization and was now considering its implications carefully. By the time she reached Daisy Cottage, the afternoon light had begun its slow transition toward evening, casting long shadows across the lane. She found Lucy preparing the sitting room for the night, drawing curtains against the growing dusk. Miss Marple instructed her to delay dinner. She had matters requiring attention, and settled herself at her small writing desk with a sheet of notepaper and a fountain pen. She wrote with deliberate care, reconstructing from memory the timeline of events as they had been established. The letter from Constance arrived approximately 3 weeks prior to the murder. Margaret summoned her sister home. Constance arrived and was surprised by something, though Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the surprise was not mutual, that Constance had perhaps anticipated Margaret's reaction to whatever revelation had prompted the summons. 1 week before the garden party, Margaret changed her will. And then, during the garden party itself, while guests mingled and tea was served, Margaret Ashworth was poisoned. But there was another timeline operating beneath this one, Miss Marple realized, a timeline that concerned Helena Wickham and Martin Ashworth. When had they met? Under what circumstances? And most importantly, what had Margaret Ashworth discovered about their relationship that would cause her to summon her estranged sister home and alter her will? She set down her pen and considered the peculiar elegance of the crime as it was beginning to present itself. If one wished to eliminate someone who stood between oneself and a desired outcome, there were several possible approaches. One could act directly, murdering the obstacle oneself. Or one could create circumstances that would cause suspicion to fall upon someone else, someone whose motive appeared obvious and whose opportunity seemed clear. Constance Drake, arriving unexpectedly from London, inheriting almost the entire estate. She was a perfect suspect. Her arrival provided opportunity, her inheritance provided motive, and her estrangement from the village made her sympathetic to suspicion. But if Constance had not murdered Margaret, then who had? Miss Marple's thoughts turned again to Helena Wickham, and she found herself considering questions she had not previously articulated. What did they know about Miss Wickham, really? She taught at the village school, yes. She was considered an excellent educator, well liked by parents and children alike. But what of her background? Where had she come from before taking the position in St. Mary Mead? Did anyone actually know the answer to that question, or had they simply accepted the surface narrative that was presented to them? At 6:30, there came a knock at the cottage door. It was young Billy, the vicar's boy, looking distinctly nervous about whatever errand had brought him to Daisy Cottage at that hour. He delivered a message. Inspector Craddock wished to see Miss Marple at the police station in the village at 8 o'clock. The inspector had certain questions he believed Miss Marple might be able to answer. Miss Marple changed into her best black dress, pinned her hat carefully in place, and made her way to the police station with the composed dignity of someone who had been summoned by authority but who remained untroubled by the prospect. Inspector Craddock received her in his temporary office, a small, austere room that had been set up in the village hall for the duration of the investigation. He offered her tea, which she declined, and settled into the chair across from his desk with her handbag held precisely in her lap. "You have been conducting your own investigation," the inspector said without preamble. It was not a question. "I have been listening to people," Miss Marple corrected gently. "People do tend to say quite a lot when they believe themselves to be in conversation with a harmless old woman. It is one of the advantages of age, Inspector. One becomes invisible." "You suggested to Miss Drake and Mr. Ashworth that Helena Wickham might be involved in the murder," Craddock continued. "On what basis did you make that suggestion?" "On the basis of observation," Miss Marple replied. "Helena Wickham was observed in close conversation with Martin Ashworth on the day of the murder. More significantly, Margaret Ashworth summoned her estranged sister home approximately 1 week after Martin began his association with Miss Wickham. And most significantly of all, Margaret Ashworth changed her will in a manner that would have dramatically altered her son's financial prospects had she died intestate. A reversal that suggests she had discovered something about Martin's character or circumstances that troubled her deeply." The inspector leaned back in his chair, regarding Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his initial estimation of her capabilities. "We have been investigating Miss Wickham's background," he admitted. "She was not, as she represented herself, simply a school teacher looking for a position in a quiet village. Her real name is Helena Carmichael. 3 years ago, she was involved in a rather significant incident in Yorkshire. A wealthy widower died suddenly, and a substantial portion of his estate was left to a young woman he had recently befriended. The case was never prosecuted because there was insufficient evidence of poisoning, but local authorities were suspicious." "And Martin Ashworth resembles this widower?" Miss Marple asked, though the answer seemed already apparent in her question. "Moderately affluent, no spouse, approaching an age where romantic companionship might seem particularly valuable. She targeted him, gained his affection, and likely encouraged him to pressure his mother regarding his inheritance. When Margaret discovered something of Miss Wickham's history, through correspondence with someone in Yorkshire, perhaps, or through her own inquiries, she brought Constance home to witness the fact that she was changing her will, making it clear that she would not be manipulated. And Helena Wickham," Miss Marple said quietly, "poisoned Margaret Ashworth during the garden party, knowing that suspicion would fall first upon Constance Drake, whose inheritance would seem to provide obvious motive." The inspector nodded slowly. "We are bringing her in for questioning within the hour. Your observations, Miss Marple, have been invaluable." But as Miss Marple rose to leave the police station, she found herself reflecting on the peculiar sadness that attended the revelation of such crimes. Not sadness for Margaret Ashworth, whose death, while tragic, had at least been prevented from being attributed to an innocent woman. Rather, sadness for Martin Ashworth, who had believed himself to be experiencing genuine affection when he had in fact been a target, a means to an end. And sadness for the fundamental human tendency toward deception, toward the construction of false identities and false emotions in pursuit of material gain. It was, she reflected, not so very different from the village itself, a community where people presented carefully curated versions of themselves to one another, where secrets lay beneath the surface of ordinary conversation, where even the most seemingly transparent relationships contained hidden depths. Helena Wickham's arrest occurred the following morning, though not without considerable drama. Inspector Craddock had arranged for her to be brought to the police station for questioning under the pretext of routine investigation, but somewhere between the school where she had been teaching and the police station itself, she had attempted to flee. A constable had intercepted her at the railway station with a ticket to London already purchased and a small suitcase containing some personal effects and a considerable sum of cash. The physical evidence of her attempted escape was, in many ways, more damning than any confession could have been. By mid-morning, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead with the velocity of wildfire, and Miss Marple found herself receiving visitors with surprising frequency. The vicar's wife called, ostensibly to inquire about Miss Marple's health after her late evening visit to the police station, but primarily to confirm the details that had already begun to circulate through the village. Mrs. Patricia Harding sent a note expressing admiration for Miss Marple's perspicacity in detecting what the official police investigation had initially overlooked. Even Gerald Thornton, the bank manager, appeared at the cottage gate with flowers and awkward congratulations. But the visitor who proved most illuminating arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon. It was Constance Drake, and she appeared considerably diminished from the composed woman who had served tea at Thornfield Manor. She was pale, her carefully styled hair had lost some of its arrangement, and there was about her an air of genuine distress that had nothing to do with the theatrical composure she had previously maintained. Miss Marple received her in the sitting-room, offering tea and biscuits with the practiced hospitality of someone accustomed to treating visitors as guests rather than intruders. Constance declined both, settling instead into the wing-back chair with the air of someone who had run out of energy for social pretense. "I came to thank you," Constance said without preamble, "and also to apologize. I've spent the last 24 hours considering my own behavior during this affair, and I've come to the uncomfortable conclusion that I have not acquitted myself particularly well. Everyone behaves imperfectly when confronted with circumstances that exceed their control," Miss Marple observed gently. "You were placed in an extraordinarily difficult position. Your sister summoned you home with mysterious urgency, and you arrived to find her murdered within days. That would disturb anyone's composure." "That is not precisely what I mean," Constance said, and there was in her voice a note of genuine self-examination. "I mean that I arrived at Thornfield Manor with intentions that were not entirely honorable. When Margaret's letter reached me in London, I did not initially come out of familial concern or a desire to reconcile. I came because I believed I was being summoned to discuss the settlement of my mother's estate, and I came with every intention of ensuring that I received a share that I believed was rightfully mine." She paused, collecting herself. "Margaret had been unfair in the original distribution when Mother died. She took certain properties that I believed should have been divided equally between us. When I received her letter, I assumed she was finally prepared to rectify that injustice. I came to St. Mary Mead prepared to be reconciled with my sister, yes, but primarily to secure what I believed I was owed." "And instead," Miss Marple said, "you discovered that your sister had summoned you home for an entirely different reason." "Yes," Constance confirmed. "When I arrived, Margaret was initially distant with me. We had tea together, and she was polite but cool. And then she told me about Helena Wickham. She had received a letter from a woman in Yorkshire, the sister of the widower I mentioned to you, the one who had died under suspicious circumstances. This woman had become concerned when she heard through a mutual acquaintance that a woman matching Helena Wickham's description had taken a position as a schoolteacher in a small English village. She wrote to Margaret warning her that Martin might be the target of a calculated campaign of seduction and manipulation. Constance rose and walked to the window, looking out at Miss Marple's garden with its carefully tended flowers and neat hedgerows. Margaret had initially dismissed the warning as the paranoid ravings of a grieving woman, but she conducted her own inquiries, and she discovered that the story was substantially true. And when she confronted Martin about his relationship with Helena, he became defensive and angry. He accused Margaret of interfering in his personal affairs, of being jealous of his happiness, of trying to control him as she had always attempted to control him. Which caused Margaret to act decisively, Miss Marple supplied. She summoned you home as a witness and changed her will to demonstrate to Martin that she would not be manipulated into providing him with resources that might be used to further this woman's designs. Exactly, Constance said, turning back from the window. And by doing so, she sealed her own fate. Because Helena Wickham, understanding that her plan had been discovered and that Margaret would ensure Martin was kept under protection, determined to eliminate the obstacle. The garden party provided the perfect opportunity, a gathering where anyone might have had access to Margaret's tea, where suspicion could be distributed among multiple suspects. And you, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, became the ideal suspect because your arrival, your estrangement, your sudden inheritance, all of these elements suggested motive and opportunity. I did not realize, Constance said quietly, that my sister had changed her will in my favor until Inspector Craddock informed me of it. I had assumed Margaret was punishing me by excluding me from any benefit, that her summons home was primarily motivated by her desire to protect Martin from his own poor judgment. When I learned that she had left me the bulk of her estate, I understood what she had been attempting to communicate, that despite our estrangement, despite the years of separation and the accumulation of resentments between us, she had ultimately trusted me more than she trusted her own son. The weight of this realization seemed to settle over Constance like a physical thing. She sat down again, and for a moment she simply stared at her hands as though they belonged to someone else entirely. I came here, she continued finally, to tell you that you are right about all of it, and to tell you that I have decided to do something with the inheritance that I believe Margaret would have approved of. I am establishing a trust fund for Martin, but the distributions will be controlled and monitored to ensure they are not simply handed over to someone who might exploit his vulnerabilities. And I am considering remaining in St. Mary Mead, at least for a time, to ensure that he receives the guidance and protection that a mother can no longer provide. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. That is a remarkably generous resolution, particularly given the circumstances of your relationship. Perhaps, Constance said, or perhaps it is simply the recognition that we are all ultimately responsible for one another, and that the estrangement I maintained with my sister was far more costly than I ever understood. The trial of Helena Carmichael, for that was the name under which she was formally charged, occupied the attention of the county courts for precisely 6 weeks. Miss Marple attended the proceedings not out of morbid curiosity, as some villagers did, but rather out of a sense of professional obligation to herself. She had begun an investigation, followed threads of logic and observation to their conclusion, and she believed it important to witness the formal machinery of justice processing the results of her deductions. The trial revealed layers of calculated cruelty that even Miss Marple, with her extensive experience of human nature, found sobering. Helena Carmichael had indeed been responsible for the death of the Yorkshire widower, though the evidence was circumstantial enough that the original authorities had deemed prosecution unwise. She had cultivated relationships with 3 separate men of modest wealth in 3 different towns over the course of 5 years, and in each case had attempted to position herself as a beneficiary of their wills. The Yorkshire widower had died before she could fully cement her position. Martin Ashworth had been selected as her fourth target, and Margaret Ashworth's intervention had disrupted what might have been a successful conclusion to her scheme. The evidence of the poisoning itself was straightforward. Traces of cyanide were found in Helena's room at the cottage where she had been lodging. A witness from the garden party, a woman whom Miss Marple had not previously considered significant, testified that she had observed Helena adding something to a pot of tea in the drawing room approximately 15 minutes before Margaret's collapse. Most damning of all, a letter was discovered in Helena's suitcase, written but never sent, in which she detailed her plan to marry Martin Ashworth, gain control of his finances, and ensure that he met with an accident within 2 years. The letter was clinical in its precision, treating human life and human emotion as merely instrumental to the achievement of financial security. Inspector Craddock gave his testimony with professional competence, presenting the case as a series of logical progressions from motive to opportunity to execution. He made particular note of Miss Marple's contributions to the investigation, mentioning her observations in a way that suggested genuine respect for her analytical capabilities. Helena Carmichael's defense attorney attempted to suggest that there were other possible suspects, that the evidence was circumstantial, that his client's attempted flight could be explained by panic rather than guilt. But even as these arguments were presented, they seemed to lack conviction, as though everyone in the courtroom understood that the machinery of justice had already reached its conclusion before the trial had formally begun. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. Helena Carmichael received a sentence of life imprisonment, a punishment that seemed to produce in her a kind of cold satisfaction rather than despair. As she was led from the courtroom, her eyes met Miss Marple's for a fraction of a second, and in that glance, Miss Marple perceived something that chilled her more profoundly than any overt threat could have done. It was recognition, an acknowledgment that Helena understood exactly what had occurred, that she had been outmaneuvered by an old woman whom she had never properly considered as a threat. The weeks following the trial saw St. Mary Mead gradually returning to its customary rhythms. The scandal faded from prominence in the local newspapers, replaced by accounts of summer fetes and agricultural shows. The village, Miss Marple reflected, possessed a remarkable capacity for absorbing disruption and then proceeding as though that disruption had never occurred. People attended church, managed their gardens, gossiped over tea, and conducted the ordinary business of village life with a determination to restore normalcy that bordered on the desperate. But certain changes had occurred that could not be entirely reversed. Martin Ashworth, released from the influence that had nearly destroyed him, seemed to have undergone a fundamental reassessment of his character and circumstances. He took on the management of several of his mother's properties, working with quiet competence and demonstrating a capacity for responsibility that no one had previously suspected he possessed. His relationship with Claire Bellingham had been renewed in a manner that suggested genuine affection rather than nostalgic revisiting of past possibilities. It was rumored that they would become engaged before autumn arrived. Constance Drake remained at Thornfield Manor, settling into village life with surprising ease. She joined the church committee, became involved in the organization of the Autumn Charity Bazaar, and demonstrated a genuine, if somewhat sardonic, interest in the affairs of the community. She and Miss Marple became unlikely friends, finding in each other a quality of clear-eyed observation that most villagers did not possess. They took tea together regularly, and their conversations ranged across topics both profound and trivial, conducted with the kind of ease that suggests two people who have seen beneath each other's carefully maintained facades and found something worthwhile beneath. On a particular afternoon in late September, as summer was finally yielding to the approach of autumn, Miss Marple received Constance in her sitting room for their weekly tea. They discussed the arrangement of flowers in the church for the harvest festival, the peculiarities of the new vicar's wife, and the minor scandals that had emerged regarding the summer fetes accounts. But as they settled into the companionable silence that characterized the end of their visits, Constance posed a question that had apparently been occupying her mind. "Do you ever regret," she asked carefully, "becoming involved in matters that could have been left to the police? Surely your life would have been considerably simpler if you had simply reported your observations to Inspector Craddock and allowed the investigation to proceed without your involvement." Miss Marple considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I regret," she said finally, "that it was necessary at all. I regret that human beings are capable of such calculated cruelty in pursuit of material security. I regret that a woman as intelligent and capable as Helena Carmichael chose to use her gifts in service of destruction rather than construction. But as to my own involvement, no, I do not regret that, because if I had not become involved, an innocent woman would have been convicted of murder, and that would have been a greater injustice than any I could have prevented through my action. The autumn of that year arrived with the kind of precision that English weather often displayed, as though someone had consulted a celestial calendar and determined that summer should end on a particular date, regardless of the calendar's official designation. The leaves on the trees that lined the lanes of St. Mary Mead turned from green to gold to rust with a gradual inevitability that seemed almost theatrical in its staging. Miss Marple, observing these changes from her cottage garden where she tended her chrysanthemums, found herself reflecting on the nature of transformation and the ways that external circumstances could alter internal realities. The church had indeed been decorated for Harvest Festival, with considerably more enthusiasm than usual, as though the village wished to celebrate something beyond the mere abundance of the season. Miss Marple had contributed her prize dahlias and several baskets of preserves to the display, and she had spent an afternoon arranging flowers alongside Constance Drake and Mrs. Patricia Harding. The work had been accompanied by the kind of conversation that occurs when women of different generations collaborate on a project, each bringing her own perspective and experience to bear on the problem of creating something aesthetically pleasing. It was during one of these afternoons, as they were arranging sheaves of wheat into an appropriate configuration, that Mrs. Harding had mentioned something that caught Miss Marple's attention with unexpected force. She had been discussing the arrangements for the harvest supper, the menu that had been planned, the logistics of feeding approximately 150 people in the church hall. And then, almost parenthetically, she had remarked that it was a shame that Margaret Ashworth could not have been present to see how successfully the community had weathered the crisis that her death had precipitated. "Margaret was always such a capable organizer," Mrs. Harding had said, and there had been in her voice a tone of genuine admiration mixed with something else. Perhaps regret, perhaps a kind of wistful acknowledgement of roads not taken. She had opinions about everything, and she was not always gentle in expressing them, but the village was better for her presence. We do not always appreciate people until they are gone. This observation had prompted Miss Marple to consider something that she had not previously articulated even to herself. Margaret Ashworth's death had created a void in the community, but it had also created a kind of liberation for those who had lived in the shadow of her strong personality. Martin Ashworth had blossomed in the absence of his mother's controlling presence, though the blossoming had required the trauma of nearly being manipulated into destructive circumstances. Constance Drake had discovered in her sister's death an opportunity for redemption, for the construction of a relationship that transcended the estrangement of years. Even the village itself, having confronted the possibility that murder could occur in its midst, seemed somehow more conscious of its own fragility and more appreciative of the ordinary rhythms that held it together. But there remained something unresolved in Miss Marple's mind, something that nagged at the edges of her consciousness like a loose thread on a sweater. The trial had concluded, the verdict had been rendered, and yet there remained certain aspects of the case that did not quite align themselves into a pattern of complete satisfaction. She had mentioned this to Inspector Craddock during one of their final conversations after the trial, and he had seemed somewhat puzzled by her concern. "The case is closed, Miss Marple," he had said. We have the guilty party in custody. We have the evidence to support the conviction, and the motive is clear. What more could one require? What more indeed, Miss Marple had reflected, and yet the sensation persisted. It was on an afternoon in early October, as she was reviewing her notes regarding the case, a habit she maintained out of a commitment to understanding the mechanisms of human behavior, that a particular inconsistency presented itself with sudden clarity. She had been examining the timeline of events, the sequence of actions that had led to Margaret Ashworth's death, when she realized that there was a detail that did not quite fit into the narrative that had been accepted by the police, the court, and indeed by Miss Marple herself. Helena Carmichael had testified, when questioned, that she had administered the poison to Margaret Ashworth's tea during the garden party, slipping cyanide into the pot, while the drawing room was briefly empty of witnesses. She had been confident in this assertion, had maintained it consistently throughout the trial, had expressed no doubt regarding the timing or the method. And yet, when Miss Marple examined the physical evidence more carefully, the position of the teacup, the pattern of the broken china, the chemical analysis of the residue, she found herself wondering whether the poison had truly been administered at the moment and in the manner that Helena had described. Miss Marple set down her notes and rose from her desk with a sense of purpose that had not characterized her movements in weeks. She had, she realized, solved the murder and ensured that a guilty woman was imprisoned, but she had perhaps not fully understood the complete architecture of the crime, the way that multiple motivations and multiple actors might have intersected in ways that the official investigation had not fully explored. It was a realization that brought with it a complicated mixture of satisfaction and deep, troubling uncertainty about the nature of justice and the reliability of her own judgments. She picked up her telephone and placed a call to the police station, requesting that Inspector Craddock visit her at his earliest convenience. There was, she informed him, a matter of some significance that required discussion, not regarding the conviction of Helena Carmichael, which she believed to be sound, but regarding the precise circumstances that had led to Margaret Ashworth's death. The inspector, she felt certain, would wish to understand the complete truth, even if that truth introduced complexities into an otherwise satisfactory conclusion. Inspector Craddock arrived at Daisy Cottage on a grey afternoon when the light seemed to have withdrawn from the world prematurely, leaving everything in a kind of perpetual twilight. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room with tea and biscuits, conducting the preliminaries of hospitality before turning her attention to the matter that had prompted his visit. The inspector settled into the wing-back chair with the air of someone who had learned to trust Miss Marple's instincts, even when those instincts seemed to contradict the conclusions already reached by formal investigation. "I've been reconsidering the events of the garden party," Miss Marple began without preamble. "Specifically, I've been reconsidering the precise moment at which the poison was administered, and the question of whether Helena Carmichael acted entirely alone in this matter." Inspector Craddock's expression shifted into one of concentrated attention. "You believe there was a collaborator?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that there was someone who possessed knowledge of Helena's intentions and who chose, for reasons of their own, to facilitate the commission of the murder. Not out of malice, precisely, and not out of a desire to harm Margaret Ashworth. Rather, out of a fundamental misunderstanding regarding what they believed they were doing and what the actual consequences of their actions would be." She set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap with the composed dignity that characterized her thoughtful moments. "I have been considering the arrangement of the drawing room on the day of the garden party. The tea service was arranged on a table near the window. Margaret poured her own tea from this service approximately 20 minutes before her collapse. However, I have been examining the physical evidence more carefully, and I have noticed something that troubled me. The teacup that was found, shattered on the floor, the one that was analyzed and determined to contain traces of cyanide, does not match the other cups in the service that was used at the garden party." The inspector leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? Does not match. The broken cup is from an older set, purchased perhaps 20 years ago. The service in use on the day of the garden party consisted of matching china from a more recent acquisition. I verified this by examining Margaret's china cabinet at Thornfield Manor. The conclusion, therefore, is that the cup containing the poison was not part of the service used during the garden party itself. It was prepared elsewhere at a different time and placed with the intention that Margaret would consume it at some point. You are suggesting that the poisoning was premeditated in a different way than we understood, Craddock said slowly. That the poison was not administered during the garden party, but rather that a poisoned cup was deliberately left where Margaret would find it and consume it. Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed. And if that is the case, then the question becomes, who had access to Margaret's private spaces, who understood her habits sufficiently to know that she would consume tea from that particular cup, and who possessed foreknowledge of Helena Carmichael's intentions? The answer, when it presented itself, seemed almost inevitable in its logic. It was Martin Ashworth who had prepared the poisoned cup, placing it in his mother's private sitting room where she customarily took her afternoon tea. He had done so not because he wished to murder his mother, but because he had believed, entirely erroneously, that he was assisting Helena Carmichael in a scheme to incapacitate Margaret temporarily, to render her unconscious for a few hours so that certain documents could be obtained and altered. Helena had manipulated him into this action by suggesting that Margaret had obtained proof of some financial irregularity on his part, proof that she intended to use to have him removed from the household entirely. Martin did not know, Miss Marple explained to the increasingly appalled inspector, that Helena intended to use the poison to kill his mother, not merely to render her unconscious. He believed himself to be engaged in a kind of protective action, preventing his mother from discovering something that would result in his complete estrangement from the family. Helena deliberately withheld the knowledge of her true intentions, allowing Martin to provide the means of access that she herself could not achieve. "This is extraordinarily serious," Inspector Craddock said, his voice carrying the weight of a man confronting implications that extended far beyond the case he had believed to be concluded. If Martin Ashworth knowingly provided the means of his mother's death, regardless of his understanding of the intent, then he is technically an accessory to murder. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "which is why I am telling you this now, in private, before bringing the matter to official attention. Because what I have discovered is not merely a question of legal culpability, but a question of human understanding and the nature of responsibility." She paused, gathering her thoughts with the care of someone about to articulate something of profound importance. Martin Ashworth is not a murderer. He is a weak man who was manipulated by a clever woman into providing a tool for murder while believing he was engaged in self-protection. He has suffered considerably as a result of his actions, the knowledge of what he inadvertently facilitated, the near destruction of his romantic prospects with Claire Bellingham, the profound violation of trust that occurred between himself and his mother in her final hours. I do not believe that additional punishment through the criminal justice system will serve any purpose beyond the satisfaction of legal procedure. "You are asking me," Inspector Craddock said slowly, "to conceal evidence of Martin Ashworth's involvement in his mother's death." "I'm asking you," Miss Marple corrected gently, "to consider whether justice serves truth or whether it serves the mechanical application of law. I'm asking you to reflect on whether the purpose of the investigation was to understand what occurred or merely to secure a conviction. And I'm asking you to consider whether exposing Martin Ashworth's inadvertent complicity serves any legitimate purpose beyond satisfying the formal requirements of investigation." The inspector sat in silence for a long moment, his expression troubled. Finally, he spoke. "I will need to consult with the Crown Prosecution Service, but I believe you may be right. The case against Helena Carmichael is sufficient and complete. Adding complexity regarding Martin Ashworth's involvement would likely result only in tragedy for people who have already suffered considerably." As the inspector prepared to leave, Miss Marple walked him to the door. "Thank you," she said simply, "for listening to an old woman's observations. The world is rarely as clear as we wish it to be. Justice is often a matter of balancing competing claims rather than achieving perfect clarity." After he had departed, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room and looked out at the gathering darkness. She thought of Margaret Ashworth, who had acted decisively to protect her son and had paid the ultimate price for that protection. She thought of Martin Ashworth, who would carry the knowledge of his inadvertent role in his mother's death for the remainder of his life. And she thought of Helena Carmichael, imprisoned for a crime she had committed with calculated precision, unaware that the person who had provided the means had acted out of ignorance rather than malice. The world, Miss Marple reflected, was profoundly complicated, and sometimes the truest justice was not the kind that appeared in court records, but the kind that acknowledged the complexity of human motivation and allowed for the possibility of redemption.